The Falcons have some cap space. Are they actually going to use it?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And, of course, today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. So if you do not know me, I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I think each and every one of you that go strong with me is it every day, or does that mean you make this podcast your first listen each and every day? And all you have to do is become an everyday or subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are answering mailbag questions. I was trying to get some guests. Unfortunately, scheduling issues. We'll get those guests on next week as opposed to this week. And so usually that means, hey, I don't have anything specific I want to talk about. So this is an opportunity for me to answer some mailbag questions, some leftover mailbag questions from some Locked On Falcons insiders, including some from February and whatnot. And so we're going to be talking about why I don't think it's necessarily a good idea that the Falcons draft a center or really any offensive player in this year's draft. Could the Falcons trade back into round one if they want to be aggressive? Sort of the expectations for this upcoming season and whether or not the vision for the Falcons in 2026 and beyond includes Terry Fontenot and Raheem Morris. But we'll start today's episode talking about the newfound cap space that the Falcons had as some extensions and restructures were filed officially, and we found out today. And so according to overthecap.com, the Falcons are now flush with cap space, roughly $11.7 million in under the cap, according to their breakdown, and that's in part due to the $8.5 million that the Falcons freed up with the Jake Matthews extension before the league year began, and $20 million roughly combined in cap space created by restructuring contracts like AJ Terrell and Chris Lindstrom. And if you missed that episode we did before the league year started back in the first week of March, we talked about all the different ways that the Falcons could create cap space, and restructuring AJ Terrell, restructuring Chris Lindstrom, and in addition, I think we said, oh, they won't touch the Jake contract with the restructure. That'll be a last minute thing, and then they did the extension on that. So, basically the Lindstrom and Terrell restructures were things that we kind of thought were very likely from the jump. So, this has led to a lot of speculation. Oh, the Falcons are moving money around because they're about to make a big move. And it's like, okay, I'm skeptical of that. You guys know I'm skeptical of all things when it comes to the Atlanta Falcons. To me, this is just, they now have enough money to sign their rookies. Maybe, this gets the ball rolling for a eventual Kirk Cousins trade after the draft so that they can eat a little bit more of Kirk Cousins' $27.5 million in base salary in order to facilitate a trade after the draft, because we know that two things that are definitely happening, in the draft, the Falcons are using that first round pick on an edge rusher. That is definitely happening. And we know that the Falcons are definitely going to be able to trade Kirk Cousins to the Cleveland Browns after the draft, after they pass on a quarterback at 2 in this upcoming year's draft. So we definitely know those things are on the horizon. And so, it's the idea of like, okay, with this cap space that the Falcons have, could they make some free agent signings now that we're in the third wave of free agency? Sure, that's possible. Do I think they're going to make a big needle moving splash signing or anything like that? No. If they're going to sign anybody, it's going to be more of these sort of cheap 1-year deals, similar to Keith Taylor and those types of moves and whatnot. And so, obviously, if I'm wrong in that assessment, we'll talk about it on the podcast, but I'm not going to sit here and gaslight you guys into telling you that, the Falcons, some big move is on the horizon. Like, they're pretty much done, I think, at this point in time. They might make 1 or 2 moves, to bolster special teams, because, boy, they love spending money on special teams. And so, it is just like, the reason I say that skepticism, A, because I'm a hater, and B, just because, like, they've spent so much money this offseason. And it hasn't really amounted to much, right? Like, when you do the math, right? 8.5 from Jake Matthews extension, $20 million from the restructures of AJ Terrell and Chris Lindstrom, and then you couple that with the $16 million that the Falcons created by cutting Grady Jarrett at the beginning of the league year. That's $44 million in combined money that the Falcons had the capacity to spend, that they created in cap space, and they spent it all on what? Right? They spent about half of that in terms of cap space on, the 4 defensive starters that they added, and Leonard Floyd, Morgan Fox, Divine Diablo, Mike Hughes. We haven't know the full details of the Jordan Fuller deal, but, that's not going to necessarily really change that math. It'll make the number go from 21 to 23 or something like that in terms of cap space in 2025. And then they devoted another $15 million on backup offensive linemen and special teams. Right? They almost spent as much money on backup offensive linemen and special teamers as they did their defense that was 28th ranked in the league. They signed, I saw the Kyle Hinton contract and I almost threw up, right? Kyle Hinton got more guaranteed money, $2.6 million guaranteed, than Kadero Hodge. And Kadero Hodge went to the Pro Bowl last year, right? Kyle Hinton got more guaranteed money than what Ray-Ray McCloud got on his contract last year, right? And so we'll see what the Fuller and Agnew contracts wind up being. But, when those contracts get fully processed and we look at the cap space that the Falcons have at that point, it's probably going to be less than $10 million. That's going to be enough to get the $4 or so million that they need to sign their rookies. And then they'll have $6 million left over, and they'll probably not really do a whole lot with that. And they'll just carry that into the summer. And if they do need to, move some money around, restructure contracts in order to create the cap space so that they can eat, $10 million of Kirk Cousins' contract, to facilitate a trade after the draft, they have the flexibility of doing that by restructuring other deals and whatnot. But, that's really it. I think the Falcons are done. So I think if you're expecting some big splash at this point in time, I wouldn't hold my breath for fear of passing out. And for those of you that are listening to the podcast, driving, we definitely don't want that to happen. Although you're probably stuck in traffic if you're in Atlanta. So, you could take a nap or two because you ain't moving in that bumper to bumper traffic for at least another 20 minutes. So, don't hold your breath. Be safe out there, guys. Don't get too excited and start swerving, through the highways or whatever, down 85 or whatever, getting excited about some big, the Trey Hendrickson trade on the horizon. Okay. I would love to be wrong, guys. I would love to come on this podcast and be wrong about that. But, I wouldn't hold my breath is basically what I'm getting at. And so we will continue today's episode, continuing to rain on your parade by talking about whether or not this is a make or break draft for Terry Fontenot and Raheem Morris, and sort of what are our expectations for those guys this upcoming season. And is that good enough for them to be still here in Atlanta as GM and head coach come 2026 as we continue today's Locked On Falcons? We know that there's nothing like watching your favorite teams live and in person, and getting tickets to see those favorite teams shouldn't be stressful. And that's where Gametime comes in, making it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. Whether it's sports, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you, Gametime is going to make it easier to get tickets thanks to their feature Gametime Picks, which is filtering out the fluff and only showing you incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. With their panoramic seat views before you buy that we love, the no surprise fees at checkout, which you just toggle on that feature in the app, or their lowest price guarantee, you can book with total confidence and peace of mind with Gametime. So download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDON NFL. For $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest priced, guaranteed. So this question comes from Demetrius J, one of our Locked On Falcons insiders. He asked this back in February. And if you want to become a Locked On Falcons insider and not only get priority in future mailbags, where we'll probably try to do at least one a month from here on out, as we've done, this is our second one in March, but not only do you get priority on future mailbags, you also get access to film breakdowns. I just recently dropped a Divine Diablo one. I'm hoping to drop a Leonard Floyd and Morgan Fox one very shortly in the next day or so. And then we'll get to Jordan Fuller and Keith Taylor and Jamal Agnew, and all those guys. So that's all in store for you. 14-day free trial as a Locked On Falcons Insider, $4.99 a month after that. So you'll be able to get all that stuff hopefully for free if I am not underestimating my ability to procrastinate on some of these things. But that being said, let's answer Demetrius J's question from February. Do you feel as if this year's draft is the last opportunity for Terry Fontenot to prove himself as a general manager? If we miss the playoffs this year, do you think Terry will get fired, or would it be more detrimental for Raheem Morris? So yes, I do think this is a make or break draft for Terry Fontenot. I don't really see a scenario where one between Terry Fontenot and Raheem Morris, one of those guys get fired. I think they're attached to the hip. If one goes, then both are going. Maybe there's some weird scenarios where you could justify keeping one, but I don't think those scenarios are that realistic. And basically, it's a very narrow bullseye to hit. So right now, it feels like either both are back in 2026 or none are back in 2026. And I don't think it's quite playoffs or bust for those guys to retain their job. Although, I think the goal is, of course, playoffs. But I do think it's kind of winning record or bust. That if they go 9-8 and still manage to miss the playoffs, and we've seen several teams every year since they expanded the playoffs, at least one team that has had a winning record has missed the playoffs, I believe, in all 4 years that they've had the expanded playoffs. So it is possible if the Falcons have a winning record and miss the playoffs. I know historically, because of how bad the NFC South has been, that has not felt like the case. And 9-8 could still wind up winning this division as well. But I do feel like it will be hard pressed for me to imagine the Falcons finishing with a winning record, and even if they do miss the playoffs, them cleaning house. Now, as we sit here today, I'm not expecting the Falcons to finish that well. My current expectations, and we'll see how this looks. It's 6 months from now when I give my official predictions, or 5.5 months from now when I give my official predictions on this upcoming season. But right now, the Falcons feel like a 7-win team. Now, that, of course, can change. And as we discussed in the previous mailbag that we did this month, roughly about 2 weeks ago, I think it was, when someone asked me about sort of the potential and ceiling for this team if they could achieve a top 5 offense but still have a bottom, say, 10 defense. And I broke down sort of what the outcomes were teams that had top 5 or top 10 offenses with a bottom 10 defense over the last 7 years since 2017. And at least with the top 10 offenses in the bottom 10 defenses, like I think 7 out of the 12 teams that achieved that since 2017, they finished below 500 in those seasons. And so, right now I kind of expect this offense to be somewhere in that 10 to 15 range. So outside the top 10. And I expect a bottom 10 defense. And right now I'm kind of expecting a bottom 5 defense at this point in time. And so that's where I'm coming with the 7-win sort of expectation with them. But the Falcons are really betting on, better defense than what I'm expecting at this point, and what I'm sure many of you are expecting with better coaching. So, I think if they have a worse record than they had last year, which was 8-9, so if they finish 7-10 and worse, I think they're probably cleaning house, and both Terry Fontenot and Raheem Morris are getting fired. To me, where the conversation becomes a lot more interesting, if they finish, say, 8-9 with the same record, right? It could kind of go either way in that case. On one hand, you could look at it and say, hey, you finish 8-9 with a first-year starting quarterback, essentially a rookie quarterback, and in general, that's an impressive start for a rookie quarterback. So the direction is pointing up in that regard, and so let's keep this thing going. And of course, on the other hand, it's just like, well, that's still not good enough. Our goal is to make the playoffs, and you finishing with another sub 500 record is not good enough. And so obviously a lot depends on how they get to however many wins they get to. Even if they win 7 games, like for example, if like they won 7 games, but they were devastated by injuries, like that would look very different than if they won 7 games with a relatively healthy roster. So let's say that the Falcons do achieve that elite offense, but the defense holds them back and is that sort of bottom tier defense. How does that factor in? It's hard to say right now, because in one hand, you could easily say, well, Raheem Morris, you're a defensive coach. You failed at fixing this defense, right? Given your defensive background. So we should get rid of you and bring in somebody else who can, right? At the same time, you could blame that on the general manager, where it's like, hey, this offseason, you had $44 million that you could have spent to improve the defense, and you spent $20 million and it didn't lead to an improved defense. For example, if they, once again, like they did last year, they finished 29th in DVOA last year. So a bottom 5 defense. So if they have another bottom 5 defense this year, that's what we're talking about. So, or do you show patience, right? And you say, okay, well, you're going to get a windfall of picks or more picks than you have this year, a normal number of picks in 2026. You're going to have a windfall of cash once you get clear of this Kirk Cousins contract situation. And so let's run it back and give you guys one last chance to show what you can do. Or do you say, hey, because we have a relatively fresh start, this is a golden opportunity for us to bring in some new guys and give them their best possible chance and not hamstring them, by delaying the inevitable by firing Terry and Raheem, and not have them have to inherit a bunch of bloated contracts because the Falcons are going to go on this big time spending spree come 2026, which seems to be the current plan, right? We've talked before a little bit about this on the podcast, but let's reiterate it, that it seems like the current Falcons plan is basically, it parallels what the Falcons did in 2022 and 2023, that their plans currently in 2025 parallels 2022, and their plans for 2026 are going to parallel 2023. And for those of you that missed that, in 2022, they had to eat a lot of dead money by trading Matt Ryan at like $40 million. And they basically just kind of spent a bunch of money on cheap free agents to kind of just tread water. And then they would have a windfall of cash in 2023 and, had a brand new quarterback in Desmond Ridder and believed that he could, figure it out on offense. Unfortunately, they were wrong in that. But, the bigger thing was, okay, now we're going to have this big cash and we're going to spend it all on these big time defensive free agents. And they did that with Jesse Bates and David Onyemata and Calais Campbell and Caden Ellis and all that stuff. And you saw the defense show the biggest growth that they had shown in a very long time in Atlanta because directly due to that spending, because several of those guys, like their 5 best defensive players on that team that year, were all free agents that they signed. And so that seems to be the same plan. They're going to eat the dead money this year. And of course, they're going to be able to trade Kirk Cousins before June 1st so that they won't have to carry dead money into 2026 as well. And they're going to eat that dead money. They're going to have a big windfall of cash. They're just kind of treading water with the defensive free agents that they're signing. And we're going to spend money on the special teams, all that stuff, and backup offensive linemen, right? That's the priority right now. And then next year, we're going to get a bunch of cash and we'll be able to, use that to fill all the holes that we are not able to fill in this year's draft on the defensive side of the ball, and we'll be ready to go. And it's like, the question is, should Terry be given the leash to basically do the thing that he's already done? It didn't work the last time you did it, but now you're going to do it again, and it's going to work this time. And how much faith do you have? And that gets to the kind of complacency conversation that we're going to continue to have. And my whiteboard is going to continue to show. We might switch it up next week, but we got to get that point across here in terms of complacency dialed up to 11. And I've gotten some pushback from some listeners when it comes to that and saying, like, I don't think it's being complacent. I think it's part of a plan. And it's like, I do think it's part of a plan. I just don't think it's a plan that is particularly likely to work, right? Like, to me, what complacency is that sort of, I think the dictionary definition is smug oversatisfaction with one's own accomplishments. And it's this idea that, like, you're overconfident basically in what you've already done and what you will be doing, and not realizing that, disaster is on the horizon is essentially how I kind of see it. And so that's why I call them complacent right now. But the reason why, if you're going to buy into this plan, it's going to be different this time, right? We've joked before about everything the Falcons do. They just do the same stuff over and over again. And they just say, this time it's going to be different. But the reason why it actually might be different this time is because instead of betting on Desmond Ridder, you're betting on Michael Penix. And we all believe that the Lisan Al-Gaib, the Kwiatkowski Haderach, the savior of the Atlanta Falcons franchise. And I say that somewhat sarcastically, but at the same time, it's like, it's the only hope we got, guys, at this point in time, that it's going to be different this time because we have Michael Penix this time, and it's going to work this time when we do that in 2026, unlike it was in 2023. And so that gets to the root of what everything is about. Everything that we're going to experience over the next 9+ months is really all about the development of Michael Penix. It's the only thing that matters this upcoming season in all regards. Everything else is secondary, tertiary to Michael Penix's development. And regardless of the wins and the losses at the end of the season, this team, this organization has to feel great, not just good, great about Michael Penix in order to be able to facilitate that 2026 plan as we have outlined it so far, right? And it's basically the idea of like, okay, we feel great about the Michael Penix pick. The way that we got there wasn't necessarily ideal. The process wasn't great, but we got the results that we wanted with Michael Penix being that franchise quarterback. And Terry and Raheem, we're going to give you the leash. We're going to give you the slack to implement your plan in 2026 and go out there and sign the 2026 equivalent of Jesse Bates and David Onyemata and Caden Ellis and all that stuff. And those guys, in addition to the draft picks that you use this year on the defensive side of the ball, all those guys making their big year 2 jumps, in addition to all the success that they're inherently going to have in year 1 as we remake this defense, right? That combination with the pieces we already have on the offense is going to combine to be a very good football team that not just we're talking about, hey, this is a team that could make the playoffs, might make the playoffs, is in the consideration for the playoffs, but not only a team that will definitely make the playoffs and also be able to push for playoff contention, make a playoff push, right? A team that's competing at the highest levels of whoever you think are going to be the top teams in the NFC, whether that's Detroit, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Tampa Bay, Minnesota, Green Bay, etc. Doesn't matter. That the Falcons going to be right in that conversation by the time we get to the end of the 2026 season. That's what you are hoping for, but you need Michael Penix and the quarterback situation to look incredible by year's end, right? To the point that you don't want to disrupt that continuity, even if the team manages to win 7 games, but you're like, man, this offense is cooking. And we just need that one more offseason to put this defense back together and do all that stuff. So that's the vision. I'm not particularly optimistic about that vision coming to fruition, right? Like I sit here and I say, and I'm sure some of you think the percentage chance I'll put on is like 5%. It's not that low. Like I think it's like 25% chance that we're living in that timeline where that vision comes to fruition. I'm sure there are plenty of you think, hey, there's a 75% chance of that vision. And I would love to be you. Again, please come join me in my therapy sessions. I would love to be able to wake up with that type of optimism about the Atlanta Falcons at any given point. And we're going to have to add a 4th session to the therapy that I need to go through to deal with the daily contention of dealing with this football team. But ultimately, the issue for the Falcons is going to be Michael Penix in the quarterback play, right? And the consistency, right? And so if this team flashes what we're talking about, but isn't consistently able to show that on a weekly basis, and again, a lot of that is coaching, right? Then I think it will be another general manager, another head coach that will be tasked with building around Penix and bringing that consistency to the table in 2026 and beyond. So I'm not sitting here today particularly optimistic, but again, 6 months from now, things could change. 9 months from now, we could be sitting here, talking about, Penix Vimber or whatever we're doing, dancing on the podcast, popping and locking about, all the great things that Michael Penix is doing and whatnot. So hopefully we will get there, but I'm not sitting here on March 26th particularly optimistic that we're going to be there. And I just think more than likely we're going to have a new coach and a new GM in 2026, which I'm sure a lot of Falcon fans that is music to their ears, but we'll just have to sort of see how it all plays out. So ultimately it all boils down to Michael Penix and what he does this upcoming season. So we'll see on that front, but we still have more questions to answer, including whether or not it makes sense for the Falcons to trade back into round 1 after they get their edge rusher at pick 15. In addition to why I don't necessarily think it's smart for the Falcons to use really any draft assets on an offense as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So our next question comes from Cameron C. Do we have enough assets for us to pick at 15 and maybe trade back in the first round to grab another guy on defense if someone they like is still around later in the first? And if so, do you see Terry pulling the trigger to get that done? I think Cameron did also ask this one in February as well. So to answer your questions, Cameron, I think no, the Falcons don't have enough assets to pull that off. And I hope Terry isn't pulling the trigger on that, right? That basically in order to pull off what you are discussing, the Falcons would probably need a 3rd round pick, right? If you go back to 2019 when the Falcons traded from 45 to 31 to get Caleb McGarry, they gave up the 79th overall pick, which is a 3rd round pick. This year they're picking 46. So you would assume to get back into round 1, they would have to give up at least a 3rd round pick to get that high. And they lack a 3rd round pick. Theoretically, could they trade next year's 3rd round pick? Sure. But the conventional wisdom is this year's 3rd is worth a next year's 2nd. That the quality of the draft pick. So the Falcons, to fill the gap for trading this year's 3rd that they would normally need to get back in round 1, they would instead have to trade next year's 2nd. And so I think you can understand why we don't think trading next year's 2nd is a optimal decision. It is a suboptimal decision. And because of the conversation we just had, you're potentially hamstringing the next general manager by limiting his assets to build this team. And so I think Arthur Blank should kind of tell Terry like 2026 draft picks are off limits in any sort of trades that you're trading. You can collect 2026 picks, but you can't give them away. Now, maybe I'll make an exception if you come to me in the war room and say, okay, they want a 6th round pick next year or a 7th round pick next year. I might be willing to give that up. But anything above that, I'm just like, nah, man, turn that trade down. So, given this team's aggressiveness on day 2 in the past 3 drafts, it's certainly in Terry's wheelhouse to do it, right? They've traded up in round 2 in each of the last 3 drafts. And since we definitely know they're taking an edge rusher in round 1 at pick 15, but even though this is just purely a hypothetical, because there's a negative 3,000% chance that the Falcons aren't going to take an edge rusher at 15. But hypothetically, if they were to say take a cornerback or D tackle or, God forbid, a linebacker at 15, maybe that would push them to be more aggressive moving up into round 1 for that edge rusher and whatnot. But of course, we know that is not going to happen. So we don't have to sit here and contemplate such hypotheticals and whatnot. So last question comes from Eric B. What do you think the Falcons can do going forward to have a better roster than they had in 2024? If that's even possible at this point, I'd also like to know what your thoughts on who could plug in at wide receiver 3. So I tend to think it's not that possible that you can improve your roster overall, right? Could you improve an individual position or two? Sure. Right. But as we've stated before, I think you can argue that the Falcons are worse at center, edge, D tackle, cornerback, and safety as things stand today. Now, those are 5 positions. The Falcons have 5 draft selections. So in theory, they could get better at those positions or at least break even at those positions by using those draft picks. But again, 2 of the 5 picks that the Falcons have are 7th round picks. So you're really betting on 7th round picks to instantly upgrade a position, which is not a good bet. So unless we can get some pre-draft trades or some trade backs on draft day that's going to acquire more 2nd, 3rd, and 4th round picks for the Falcons, it's going to be hard to improve all 5 of those areas of the roster. Now, as for wide receiver 3, I think you just kind of run it back with the current group. I feel like you have 6 decent wide receivers on the roster. You still have 2 very good ones, and guys 3 through 6, I think, are certainly there's lots of room to upgrade at this point in time. But I think at this point, you just kind of punt that to next year. And I think you punt pretty much all your offensive positions in terms of drafting to next year. Now, again, you want to take a flyer on an offensive guy in round 7 or something like that. I'm not going to sit here and complain about that, at least not too much. But to be with your premium picks in the first 4 rounds, I'd be very hesitant for the Falcons to do that if I'm advising the Falcons, right? And the reason is because of what we talked about before, where I don't have a lot of confidence that this coaching staff is going to be around here. And I've seen a lot of people talk about the center position as a position that they would like to see the team draft because they have seemingly struck out on all the veteran options unless David Andrews is coming walking through that door, and we'll have to wait and see on that. But maybe I'll feel differently about the center position. After I watch more film of the centers in this upcoming class, which is probably we're a week or 2 away from that. But the reason why I say that is because I'm worried about a Matt Hennessy situation 2.0, right? In 2020, the Falcons used a 3rd round pick on Matt Hennessy, knowing that he was going to replace Alex Mack the following year. But Dan Quinn and Thomas Dimitroff, who drafted Matt Hennessy, got fired in 2020. And they brought a new coaching staff, and that was Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot. And they drafted a center the following year in Drew Dahlman in the 4th round. And Hennessy did start in 2020. And Dahlman was his backup, but then Dahlman took his job in 2022, and Hennessy spent the next 2 years and then a 3rd year this past year when they brought him back after he signed with the Philadelphia Eagles last offseason as a backup. And so you use a 3rd round pick on a player that started 1 year out of 5 in Atlanta in Matt Hennessy. And even though I'm not necessarily a believer in Ryan Newsel as a starter for you at this point in time, I think the chances are low as we sit here today that you're going to find a center that's going to immediately come in and be an upgrade over him. Right now, again, I might feel differently once I dive into the film at this point in time. And it's not to say that there aren't centers that are better than Ryan Newsel. I think you can find a center that is better than Ryan Newsel. But the challenge is being a immediate plug-and-play starter at the center position is not that easy. It's a hard position for a guy to come in and play, and particularly play at a high level. More than likely, you can find a better center than Ryan Newsel, but that guy's probably going to be more of an average to replacement level starter, at least in year 1. And then you hope for growth in year 2 and beyond. But we'll see on that front. So my worry is like you use a 4th round pick on the center, and you draft that guy and maybe he takes Newsom's job this year or whatever, but you go into next offseason and be like, okay, this 4th round center is definitely going to be our starting center. And then you fire Raheem Morris and whatnot, and new coaching staff comes in and they completely scrap that plan, which happened with Matt Hennessy and Drew Dahlman. It also happened when the previous coaching staff took over, when Dan Quinn and company came in, where everybody assumed, oh, Joe Hawley's going to be the starting center because he's been solid for this team the last 2 years at the center position, or a year and a half at the center position. And then the Falcons replaced him with Mike Person. And, looking this up, that's been a trend that I have noticed a bunch in recent years, where teams that change coaching staffs tend to change centers as well, right? There are 4 starting centers that have signed with new teams this offseason, right? And 3 of those 4 went to teams with new head coaches. You look at last year's 7 different head coaching changes in last year ahead of the 2024 season. 5 of those 7 teams that changed coaches also changed their starting center. And so for me, if let's say we're talking about a 4th round pick at the center position, right? That to me is just a better usage of that pick, of that draft asset, on a defensive player. The defense needs as much help as humanly possible. Even if you draft a defensive player that is a backup, this defense needs so much help that it's better than nothing. To me, drafting a backup offensive player or offensive lineman, to me is just suboptimal outcome at this point in time. And because I don't have the confidence that whoever you draft on that side of the ball is going to be retained by this coaching staff beyond this upcoming season, I feel like that's a bad choice. So, again, if you want to use a late day 3 pick on offense, I'm not going to complain too much about that. But to me, in the first 4 rounds for the Falcons, it should be defense. Just basically take the best non-linebacker available in those rounds. Of course, after you take the best edge rusher available in round 1, because of course that definitely has to happen. So the only exception on the offensive side of the ball for me is, maybe you take a fullback, and, if you take JJP, the defensive tackle from Mississippi, you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You get a fullback and a defensive tackle. So, that's the best of both worlds. But outside of finding that 2-way defensive player that also can double as a fullback, that's the real linebacker you take. You just take a slow linebacker and turn him to a fullback. Then I can justify taking a linebacker at some point. I'm looking at you, Danny Stutzman. But no. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on that. So I would, again, my opinion may change in 2 weeks after I watch the center film, and I'll be like, oh, I know I changed my mind. I really like some of these centers, and I definitely want to have one of these guys on the roster. Maybe that happens in 2 weeks, but basically I'm just defense. And then, in round 7, okay, take a flyer on somebody. But at that point, it is what it is. So I hope those answers your questions, Eric, as well as Cameron and Demetrius. We'll be back tomorrow with Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta to talk about whatever topics come to mind. We didn't get into the Felipe Franks conversation last week, so maybe this week we get into it. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, where Keith Sanchez and Damian Parson talking all day, every day about this upcoming draft and the edge rushers and the non-edge rushers that the Falcons may or may not take in round 1. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.